First, I complied. First, I signed. First, I closed my door when they asked me to. They cataloged compliance like an inventory. First, I was cooperative. Then I was helpful. Then I was a contact. A contact once listed becomes a pattern. I learned to like the forms. There was an order to everything: boxes, lines, checkboxes, signatures. My handwriting grew tidy under pressure. I initialed received policies with the ease of someone who believes policies will protect them. They handed me a manual on escalation. It was 312 pages of flowcharts and lists. It smelled of glue and a kind of careful optimism. In meetings, I conveyed acquiescence like a practiced actor. Yes, I said into a microphone that never picked up the small tremor in my throat. No, I said when they asked about conflicts, and my no felt boxed, neat, tidy. Cooperation has benefits. It keeps your email active. It keeps your access keys valid. It keeps the forms that allow you to breathe stamped, approved. I was polite because the world rewarded politeness. I learned how to couch questions as curiosity. I learned to put "for clarity" at the top of every request. When anomalies first appeared, I approached them the way a librarian approaches a misshelved book. There was an invoice that misaligned dates. There was a name on a shipping manifest that did not match any employee ID. There were ledgers whose totals would not reconcile if you rounded in a particular way. I filed tickets. I sent polite procedural emails with subject lines like, "Request for clarification." I attached screenshots and logs, and I wrote the dates in full to avoid ambiguity. No alarm bells rang. A reply arrived. Noted, see me later. Later is a word dressed in goodwill. It can mean concern. It can mean a request for patience. It can also be the hinge on a door you didn't know was closing. They asked about my sleep. They asked whether I had been under stress. They offered mindfulness modules and wellness webinars with soothing titles. It is easy to accept help. Humane offers arrive with polite calendars. They come with links and disclaimers and the right amount of empathy. I attended the sessions. I filled out the forms. I wrote truthfully that I slept poorly and sometimes felt anxious for reasons I could not name. That was enough. Soon I was in a file folder with a flag. Not a red flag. A small discreet red dot near my name. Once there is a dot, the machinery of containment finds its rhythm. Calendars change. Invitations omit you. Shared drives acquire new permission layers that your requests for access never clear. It is almost perfunctory. Someone CCS a manager and then deletes the thread. Someone schedules a meeting and puts no attendees in the booking. Someone in procurement copies another person on correspondence, then the copy disappears from the saved record. I noticed. Not as a drama, but as a pattern. I printed logs. I took timestamps with my phone so I could show exact seconds if needed. I traced the edits until the trail grew thin. I learned to read silence between messages. Silence can be an instruction. Silence can be a redesign of who is present in the room. Then they called me into a room with the glass that looked both ways. They asked me to sit where a camera had a clear view of my hands. They asked if I understood the access matrix. I said I did. They asked me to verbally confirm my obligations. I spoke the words they provided for me. I learned to say "I understand" with measured inflection. They told me a review had been scheduled. A review is a calendar item that rearranges permissions. They told me it was routine. They told me it was part of a process. A process is often a way to make decisions feel impartial. The review began with small clarifications. They asked me to recount the steps I had taken on a project last quarter. I answered with numbered bullets and timestamps. I showed them logs and tracebacks and the history of a commit. They watched that history like a film. They asked why a handoff had been done at 1703 instead of 1659. I explained the context. They raised their eyebrows like bookmarks. A chart showed my access patterns compared to others. A graph has the authority to turn a human into a dot on a line. They asked whether I had shared credentials. I said no. They asked whether I had shared a workspace link with an external address. I said no. They asked me if I had clicked links that came from strangers. I said once, when in doubt, I asked for verification. Every answer weaves a rope. Sometimes the rope holds you, sometimes it binds you. They told me there was no evidence of malicious intent. They told me the decision was about risk posture. Risk posture is a phrase that sounds like a neutral architectural plan. It is, in practice, a map drawn to reroute people. They trained an algorithm to flag unusual behavior. That algorithm had been fed with lists of exceptions from many years. Exceptions accumulate into a lexicon. A lexicon becomes a policy. They showed me an excerpt of policy and circled words. They circled access, unapproved, external, pattern. I recognized the pattern of words, and not the pattern of actions. They asked me to leave my access keys with security while they complete the administrative review. I slid the keys into a labeled envelope. It felt like returning a set of tools I had used every day. Access was revoked in stages. My admin account went to read-only and then to locked. My badge stopped unlocking doors at 1700 on a Tuesday. My group memberships dissolved like sugar in hot water. Email forwarding was disabled. My calendar entries remained on others' timelines, but I could not open their details. I found myself on the outside of my own projects. I watched notifications as if they were a film of the life I had once helped run. I moved through the office carrying the impression of someone whose permissions had been rewired. I was still paid, still assigned desks, still expected to attend some meetings. Expectation without authority is a peculiar kind of labor. I filed an appeal because there was a form for that too. I filled it with the same careful handwriting I had once used to affirm. I attached the logs again and wrote a narrative of context. I requested a timeline and a point of contact. A week passed, and then another. An automated reply confirmed receipt. We are processing your request. Processing is a verb that stretches strange distances. There were interviews with HR and with the compliance team. I answered each time and left the room lighter by the weight of not having lied. They asked me whether I had personal relationships that could influence procurement. I said no. They asked about travel with colleagues. I described training trips and invoices. Every detail folded into the file like a page. In the weeks that followed, new rules appeared in the portal. Training modules were updated, and mandatory checkboxes emerged on pages we'd read before. All of a sudden, minimal actions were required to maintain status. They sent a quiz about data handling that had 5 questions and a pass threshold. I completed it. They said the policy had evolved. Evolved is a gentle word for corrective architecture. They installed a log that kept track of who requested which permission and when. That log had a dashboard with colored tiles. Colors make patterns feel knowable. Green meant approved. Orange meant pending. Red meant review. Red in a dashboard feels like a small pulse over your name. Rumors circulated in quiet ways. A coffee machine conversation spiraled into a list of names. A manager said offhand, "We're tightening the circle." A friend moved teams and then moved countries. Peers offered counsel in the form of checklists: document everything, change passwords, go to HR with a witness. I did as advised. But advice is company and not always salvation. I regained one permission for a week to retrieve archived files. It felt like being allowed back into a room to fetch a coat I had left on a chair. I was patient because patience felt like a strategy. At times I was exhausted with the small rituals of justification. At times I was surprised by the ordinary kindness of others who offered to print documents or forward what I could no longer see. Kindness doesn't always change policy, but it changes days. Then, unexpectedly, a new review cycle began. They said that a policy update applied retroactively to all accounts of interest. Of interest is a phrase that strips a person of details, leaving only a vector. They convened a room with chairs in a semicircle. They asked me to sit in the middle. They explained again that reviews are about trust and safety. They had a facilitator who used phrases like harm minimization and operational integrity. They played a slide deck in which anonymized case studies displayed graphs and heat maps. One slide had a timeline that ended with access revoked. It was clinical and gentle and precise. Clinical descriptions tend to make human consequences look tidy. They asked whether I had suggestions for improving the workflow. I gave suggestions that had once been heard and then postponed. They politely documented my suggestions and folded them into an action item list. Action items are promises that exist in other people's calendars, not always yours. My evenings changed. I stopped volunteering for cross-team projects because the risk of another flag felt too real. I learned to keep my home address off certain forms. I began to use a new email for external requests. I stopped joining group chats that discussed vendor relationships. Social capacity is a form of currency. I began to spend it more carefully. My partner asked questions I did not always answer. Not answering is also a way to hold something private. My friends asked whether I felt betrayed. I said that it felt like a redistribution of trust. The algorithm didn't mean to be cruel, it meant to be efficient. It reduced context to tokens and then to counts. It ranked anomalies against a baseline built from years of logs. I was an outlier in a dataset that had been trained to expect uniformity. Outliers make models nervous. The model produced a score and a tag. The tag landed in an inbox and in a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet has the authority to translate a person's messy week into a numeric risk. Those numbers are persuasive in rooms where legal counsel sits across from operations. The day came when they said the review was complete. They sent a document with a footer and an approval code. They labeled their decision deaccessioning. Deaccessioning is a word used in museums and archives when items leave a collection. Here, that word applied to a person. They wrote reasons with neutral adjectives. They wrote pattern of unusual access and inconclusive correlation to policy. I read the words as if they were a map where I could no longer find landmarks. They offered remediation as an option. Remediation meant another training, another module, another signed form. Remediation meant the chance to be measured again. I accepted remediation because it seemed like the path back. I completed the modules with a careful attention to every slide. I retook the quizzes until my score was impeccable. I met with a coach who taught me how to phrase requests in ways that lowered flags. I learned to add context proactively and to place witnesses on email threads. Slowly, permissions returned in a drip. But a return is not the same as a reclaim. I could open some files, but not the ones that mattered most. I could enter certain rooms, but not others. The network of trust had been rearranged, and I had to relearn how to move in it. I began to see that access is not only a technical privilege. It is social and psychological. It is the ability to participate and also to be believed when you speak. It is the right to a particular kind of solitude in which you are trusted to act. When access is withdrawn, the contours of who you are at work change. The community of colleagues reorients itself. Some conversations use new verbs. People began to route requests differently around me. I watched as someone else became the go-to for the things I had done. It felt like watching a shadow grow where a light had been. I kept the envelope with the keys in a drawer. Sometimes I would take it out and feel the blunt weight of what used to be mine. Sometimes I would fold the paper between my fingers and think about the small kindnesses that had carried me. In the end, permanence was a promise conditional on review. The system that held me once would also unhold me. There is a strange intimacy in being catalogued. It teaches you the names of your own limits. I learned to write with that awareness. I learned to ask for context as a precondition for cooperation. And I learned that when access is permanent, it is only as permanent as the policies that govern it. I stayed after the document was signed. Not because anyone asked me to. Because leaving felt too decisive. Rooms remember people in small ways. A chair angled slightly toward a screen. A drawer that closes softer than the others. Fingerprints that exist only in habit. I walked the hallway slowly. As if speed might confirm an ending. As if distance could finalize something I was not ready to name. No alarms sounded. No announcement followed me. The building continued its quiet industry of light and ventilation and muted conversation. Systems rarely dramatize removal. They prefer subtraction so gentle it feels like weather. Outside, the air carried the ordinary temperature of an unremarkable day. Cars moved with patient indifference. Someone nearby laughed at something unrelated to me. Irrelevance is a clean sound. I checked my phone out of reflex. No new messages. No silent reversals. Hope, when procedural, refreshes like an inbox. Days reorganize themselves. Morning no longer required authentication tokens or dashboards. Coffee tasted different without urgency attached to it. Time expanded into spaces I had forgotten existed. Spaces without metrics. Without performance summaries. At first, the quiet felt like absence. Then it felt like pressure releasing from a sealed room. I opened my laptop out of habit. The screen contained only what I placed there. No inherited urgency. Ownership, I realized, is different from access. Access is permission inside someone else's structure. Ownership is responsibility without witnesses. I began to write things that were not requests. Not clarifications. Not defenses. Sentences that did not need approval felt unfamiliar at first. Language changes when it is no longer monitored. It grows quieter, but also more exact. I noticed how often I had once translated myself into acceptable formats. How many edges I had softened before speaking. Containment had taught me elegance, but freedom required honesty instead. Weeks passed without incident. Nothing collapsed. Nothing demanded immediate repair. Catastrophe, it turns out, is often administrative rather than physical. People from the old system appeared occasionally in messages. Careful wording. Neutral concern. Hope you're well. A sentence that means many things and commits to none. I replied politely. Politeness survives even when structure does not. Some never wrote at all. Silence can be loyalty to the present. I did not blame them. Systems teach distance as a form of safety. Seasons shifted without requesting credentials. Light changed its angle across the floor each morning. No dashboard recorded it. Unmeasured change feels almost fictional. One evening I opened the envelope again. The keys were still inside. Cold. Ordinary. Objects rarely understand the meaning assigned to them. I placed them back and closed the drawer. Not ceremonially. Just completely. Completion does not always arrive with sound. Later, walking through a different building, one with no history attached to me, I noticed something subtle. No one there knew my former permissions. No one measured me against an archived version of myself. Identity, outside surveillance, becomes lighter. I introduced myself without titles, without context heavy enough to bend expectation. Conversation flowed differently. Less cautious. More present. Trust built slowly there. Not from credentials, but from consistency. Consistency is harder to automate. I worked on smaller things. Clear beginnings. Visible endings. No invisible reviewers. Mistakes belonged to me directly. So did corrections. Responsibility without abstraction feels almost physical. Sometimes memory returned unexpectedly. A phrase. A notification sound heard in public. The body stores procedures longer than the mind intends. But the intensity faded. Not erased. Just reclassified. Like a file moved to cold storage. I began to understand something I could not see before. Permanent access had never been permanence. It was continuity, dependent on approval. Real permanence, if it exists at all, lives outside permission systems. In memory. In consequence. In the quiet ways experience reshapes choice. Nothing reviewed those. Years from now, no dashboard will display what happened. No policy update will summarize it. But I will still move differently through rooms. Still read language for hidden architecture. Still recognize how softly doors can close. And when someone tells me access is permanent, I will hear the second sentence they did not say. Until it is reviewed. I learned to notice the quiet thresholds. Doors that required a polite knock even when they were unlocked. Folders that had been renamed to hide histories. A calendar entry that read, reschedule, internal, and never told me why. Those thresholds taught me how to measure caution. Not by the loud gestures, but by the small ones. By the way a sentence finished without a period. I kept diaries for a while. Not the kind the policy team would authorize. Handwritten lines in a cheap notebook. They were private in the old sense, ink, paper, a fold of corner. Writing without spectator protocols felt disobedient and necessary. It reminded me how language could be raw instead of formatted. At work, I invented new rituals. A weekly note to myself. Did you make space for what matters? A list of 3 things I could finish that week without asking for permission. Completing those things made small, private maps. Maps I could follow without consulting a dashboard. People began to notice different facets of me. Some found the quieter version easier to work with. Others missed the person who had once been everywhere. A few colleagues asked honest questions about process and fairness. They were the ones who had also been slowed by new checks. We met in corners of the office where the HVAC hummed just loud enough to keep us private. We compared notes about the shifting language in memos. We tried, half joking, to map the invisible fences. There is a particular kind of solidarity that grows when people experience the same quieting. It is not loud. It does not demand headlines. It asks only that someone else knows your calendar anomalies. I also learned the more complicated lessons about leverage. Some resources could be shifted with a single signature. Some permissions were held by people whose jobs depended on not noticing. The architecture that had displaced me felt less like a machine than like a set of choices made by tired people. I started attending meetings that were not strictly my meetings. I listened rather than spoke. Listening became a way to learn where loops existed that I could not see. I took notes on who was asked for what and how answers were delivered. I stored names and phrases like landmarks. Gradually, I learned how to move around certain obstacles, not by breaking rules, but by speaking in ways that didn't trigger flags, by making requests that a review algorithm would deem routine. That knowledge felt compromised and useful at once. It was a skill set built from adaptation. One could call it survival. Then I began to teach others. A friend in procurement asked for help wording a vendor request. A junior engineer wanted to understand why their access was restricted after a merge. I gave them templates I had developed. Small, careful language. Teaching felt like giving shelter. But shelter is partial. You can instruct someone how to avoid a puddle, but you cannot move the flood. Outside the office, the world did not pause. News cycles described policy updates in neutral voices. Articles spoke of strengthening controls and protecting assets. Rarely did reports dwell on the granular ways in which people were remapped. I wrote one op-ed-like piece that never made it past an editor's review. It read, "Structures that promise permanence often fail to account for the human mobility they require." It was heavy with examples and light on rhetoric. Somewhere between the desk and the submission button, I reconsidered. The risk of being cataloged again felt immediate. So I left the piece in a private folder and titled it plainly, "Observed." You cannot always speak everything you feel. Sometimes you must teach in subtler ways. Sometimes you must scaffold others' understanding so they can speak for themselves. Months later, a committee formed to review operational impact. I was invited to participate, not because my access had returned fully, but because someone in compliance remembered the way I had once explained a workflow. Participation felt double-edged. It offered a chance to change a process and reminded me how easily one could be co-opted. We met in a conference room with a table that gleamed as if polished for ceremonies. There were facilitators with muted suits and legal counsel whose pens never stopped. I brought the notebook I'd kept. I read aloud a few anonymized entries. The room grew quieter. Someone asked a practical question about tracking exceptions. Another asked about remediation timelines. We proposed a mechanism for transparency, a publicly accessible dashboard that explained why certain permissions were revoked and how appeals were progressing. The idea met polite nods and guarded skepticism. "Security concerns," said one person. "Operational complexity," said another. A legal counsel recommended redactions. But an engineer on the panel, someone with a soft voice and a way of diagramming processes on sticky notes, argued for a small experiment, a week-long transparency pilot for non-sensitive cases. "Start small," she said. "Measure effects." Her tone suggested curiosity rather than proof. We set up the pilot. It was modest, a page with anonymized case IDs and status updates. It noted timelines and responsible teams and the appeal outcomes. We left out details that were genuinely sensitive. We included a narrative field where people could write, in their own words, what they had experienced. The pilot's first week produced unanticipated results. Some readers found comfort in the clarity. Managers used the page to explain delays instead of letting silence do the work. HR used it to coordinate remediation trainings more rapidly. A few people who had been flagged for unusual activity found that the transparency turned a speculative tag into a concrete pathway back. The change was not a revolution. It was a very small elbow in a larger mechanism. But elbowing matters. Metal wears when pressure is applied consistently. Over time, the pilot grew into a standing practice. Not all teams adopted it. Those that did reported fewer repeated flags for the same people. Appeal times shortened. People began to request context more often and to receive it. I felt a complicated relief. Part of me kept the envelope with the keys as if it were a talisman. Part of me believed the pilot's small success mattered. What else changed was subtler. Conversations about risk began to include language about restorative practice. Policy drafts referenced human review before deaccession. Those were words. Words must be watched. But words are also the raw material of change. There were setbacks. Some updates hardened again after a security incident elsewhere. A new algorithmic rule flagged a different set of behaviors, and a young engineer I had mentored lost access for a cycle. We rallied. We used the dashboard to show context. The appeal worked. I learned an important truth about systems change. You do not replace a system by insulting it. You change it by showing a viable alternative and by proving it does not break the things people are afraid it will. The work was slow and often felt performative. But over time, small practices accumulate like stitches in fabric, eventually wearing through the places that are already thin. Years later, there were policy changes that included explicit commitments to transparency, to remediation timelines, and to human review in borderline cases. The language was still legal and sometimes clunky, but it included new phrases like right to explanation and appeal throughput. I do not claim credit. Systems are shaped by many hands, by luck and timing and people tired enough to persist. But I watched a small thing become less small. What stayed with me was not only policy language but a sensibility. An insistence that permanence should be measured against a person's dignity. That reviews must be transparent enough to be contestable and compassionate enough to be reparative. I kept the envelope for a while. Sometimes I took the keys out and placed them in my palm. They were ordinary metal. They held no magic. What mattered was the memory of how it felt to have worth determined by a log. If I had a final lesson, it would be this. Permanence is a claim. Review is the condition under which that claim will be tested. You can build practices that make review fairer. You can stitch transparency into operations so that people are not unmoored by process. And perhaps most importantly, when systems say trust, ask what it costs the person being trusted. When systems say permanent, remember the word carries an asterisk. Subject to review.